My name is Jean-Jacques Sahal. I'm the chair of the International Institute of Communications UK chapter. In a minute, my colleague Olivier will say a few words from an ISOC England's perspective. And I won't go into the detail. I just wanted to really welcome you all. So we have a mix of members of the IIC who are both from the public and private sector, experts in ICT policy, and we gather every 2 months or so in seminars a bit like this one, where we have discussions on really forward-looking policy around digital matters. I should flag up that very refreshingly we're thinking of having our next event around Brexit. And what it might mean in terms of things like the EU's digital single market and digital policy. So we might have several events on the matter because, of course, there's quite a number of dossiers and impacts on privacy, telecoms, etc.
One should be in Scotland.
And we might. Indeed, we'll see. So we will try not to talk about Brexit tonight. It's quite difficult these days, I think, not to talk about Brexit. I actually just came back by train from that bastion of tyranny, Brussels. So it's very difficult not to talk Brexit, but I won't. We've got a fantastic panel and a fantastic topic today, a really important one. And of course, yes, we've been talking a lot about Brexit, but in our sector digital, this is probably one of the key questions that affects us, both as organizations, but also as individuals. So I'm really looking forward to the discussions. The format is basically that we'll have some introductory words from the panelists, and it will be followed by really an interactive discussion. So it won't be just a panel discussing the debate, the issue amongst themselves, but very much interacting with you all. So be ready with your questions. And the idea is to be forward-looking. Of course, there are some very topical bills going through and debates, but it's trying to think more long-term. How should we approach privacy and security online in the future from a policy perspective, in this sort of era of convergence between the two? I know that it's completely new, but still we should think about the future. And I think, and after the debate, we will have some drinks outside. Thank you, TechUK, for hosting us and for the drinks. And with that, I will pass on to Olivier for a few words from ISOC.
Yeah, just a couple of words quickly. I'm Olivier Crépin-Leblanc, I'm the chair of the English chapter of the Internet Society. When Jean-Jacques and I, we actually see each other quite a few times throughout the year with ICANN, with all sorts of other things that we're involved with. And more recently, we have been spending some time discussing the investigatory powers bill that is going through Parliament, and I think that's one of the reasons for this discussion to take place, because there is an element of privacy, of course, changing when you do have the security services being able to get into your machine at will without your ISP knowing, etc., etc. We don't know how this is all going to be implemented yet, and I've seen that the Lords have been working quite hard in making some further amendments, so the story is ongoing. The bill was proposed by Theresa May, and she's now Prime Minister, so that's another interesting angle to an interesting twist to the story. I'm not sure who's going to take over from her to
Not David Davis, Amber Rudd.
Amber Rudd. Okay, so that's where we are today. I have been in touch with some of the panelists regarding the IP bill, specifically on a point which ISOC England had been concerned about, and that's to do with the permissionless innovation side of things, where you need to actually, if you have any communication system that is whether web-based or app-based, and you're going to present it and propose it to UK customers, you need to be in touch with the government if you have over a certain number of customers, and provide them with full details on how the encryption technology is used and how it works. It doesn't say you have to have a backdoor, but it says that you have to give full details. So maybe that's another break into the discussion that we can have today. I think that's it really. I'm really glad that we've got a good group. Yes, we have, so we're doing things a little bit ad hoc here because we realized we didn't have any way to record this. Usually we do meetings by Chatham House rule, but obviously if we're recording, it doesn't become Chatham House except if you have a blank picture and you change the voices. So that's obviously not the thing. So first I was going to ask our panelists if anybody has an objection to being recorded, and then ask our audience also if there was any objections to this being recorded and then put on either the IIC or the ISOC website or YouTube or Facebook, whatever. Maybe not Facebook, maybe not YouTube, we'll see.
And we can also do it that just the panel discussion is recorded, and if you guys think it would be more conducive to discussion, we don't have to record the audience participation part. But is there any objection from the audience?
That's a good balance.
Good balance.
You prefer that balance, okay.
So all the people who haven't paid their parking tickets will be okay, you're all safe.
I wanted to give you an opt-out, it was exercise. Duly noted.
Right, well, thanks very much. So let's get on, yep.
Thank you very much. Well, I guess for starters, let me just say that my name is Anne LaFrance, and I head up our telecom and data protection / cybersecurity practice at Squire Patton Boggs. And it's, you know, as a law firm and a lawyer working in private practice, having really focused vertically on telecoms and the internet for the past 30 years of my life, the past 2 years have just exploded with cybersecurity and data protection issues in this area. And even today, the courts have given us some new news, which is that Microsoft has won a victory in the United States in the Second Circuit Court of Appeals on the very famous case where it was required by a warrant by a lower court to export or import data from its European Irish subsidiary, from its cloud in Ireland through, you know, that was stored there via a contract with a European client that had no touch with the United States, solely by virtue of the fact that Microsoft is a U.S. company with an Irish affiliate. And the court found, I haven't read the decision yet, but reportedly the court found that the relevant legislation does not allow for that kind of long-arm reach. However, it is the relevant legislation, so I think we will see that, pardon me, we will probably see that there is going to be an initiative to change the legislation. So basically, I raised that because this particular area, cybersecurity, data protection, whether there's Brexit or no Brexit, we are going to see that there is this is global. It is something that crosses borders. You know, whether to encrypt and not to encrypt. Clients of ours in the tech industry who have decided to encrypt end-to-end and who provide services that are effectively public services are caught between the rock and the hard place, because they want to provide these services in countries like Egypt and countries like China, and the only way that they can be sure that these services are offered in a way that is going to give confidence to users that they're not being surveilled for no good reason, is if they encrypt end-to-end. This causes huge issues, and of course we're seeing the results of that now in clampdown legislation in many countries, not least here and in the United States. So this development is very tricky, very difficult, and I think we'll hear a lot about that today. The other thing I wanted to just point out before I move on and pass the microphone on to the panelists who have much more experience in the deep areas that we're talking about, is that the regulatory investigatory powers bill has been challenged. There is a court appeal pending, right, or challenge pending before the courts here in the UK now. You may know that the person who brought that was none other than David Davis. So how that is going to work out, and what the long-term result of that, and whether Theresa May will change her views as Prime Minister from her position, as a Home Secretary, will be very interesting to watch. So without further ado, let me introduce the panelists. We have Renaud Di Francesco, who is the Director of Europe Technology Standards Office at Sony Europe, immediately to my left. We have Talal, what is your last name? Ojab. Sorry, I didn't have that last name because unfortunately Charlotte Holloway could not be with us today, but Talal, who is the head of cybersecurity policy, is a very good stand-in for her, and I'm sure actually probably was going to feed Charlotte all the information that she was going to impart. So now we get it direct from the horse's mouth. And last but not least, we have Robin Wilton, who is with the ISOC, and let me see, we didn't decide who would go first. Who would like to take over first, make comments? Robin, would you like to, do you want to start, or? I thought you might set the broad view. Yeah?
Okay.
Shall we do that?
Sure.
Want to pass
Thanks.
that down? Thanks.
Thank you.
Just to
Well, so
explain.
first, I guess, félicitations to our French colleagues for the 14th of July. I did go to a thing a few years ago, several years ago, where someone said that, and it was a meeting in Paris. And one gentleman stood up at the table and drew himself up with great solemnity and said, "My family does not celebrate this date," because he turned out to come from a family, a long line of aristocrats who had not had much fun since then. But anyway, those of us who've survived, I guess, have something to celebrate. The word that jumped out at me first about the title of this event was the word convergence. And in one sense, that made me very optimistic, because at least it didn't say balance between or trade-off. Because I think that's a really pernicious starting point, this idea that if you sacrifice some privacy, you get some security in return, and that it's the so-called zero-sum game, because it really isn't. Fortunately, in the last 2 years or so, people have started to say things like, you can't actually have security for citizens unless they have some privacy. And verse as well, that they can't have privacy unless they have some tools that provide them with security. So I think it's good that we're now recognizing much more that privacy and security are discrete but codependent disciplines. I come from mostly a technical background, I suppose. I've spent more of my time in the last 10 years translating than actually doing anything technical. But I do have a technical background. And if I look at privacy through that lens, it's clear to me that technology alone cannot fix the privacy problem. And therefore, we're going to need policy and other measures. So I thought it might be useful just to give you a couple of simple examples to think through. There's this idea in the privacy canon, first I think written about by Helen Nissenbaum, called contextual integrity. And this is the idea that in order for me to have privacy, if I disclose something in one context, that's the context it ought to stay in. So if I tell my GP about my embarrassing ailment, I want that information to stay in that context. If I then find it on embarrassing ailment of the month website, with a picture of me and a smiley face, I will feel that my contextual integrity has been violated because something that has been taken out of one context and put into another one. And so that's one kind of privacy violation. Well, what that says to me is that if I can't maintain confidentiality between me and the person I disclose to, then my privacy is potentially at risk. But if you look at that from a technical point of view, if you say to someone, how do I ensure the confidentiality of an exchange between me and Olivier? They'll say, well, encrypt your message. Well, that's okay. So I encrypt my message, I send it to Olivier, he gets an encrypted message with which he can do nothing, unless he also has a key. So in giving him the key, because I do want him to read the message, I have given him the means to remove the technical protection that I placed on that message. I do want Olivier to read it, but I don't want Philip to read it. But I can't stop Olivier from giving it to Philip. So even in a very simple two-party case, the technical measure that I apply must be reversible by the recipient. And that in turn is as if I had not applied any technical protection to it at all. Now that's a problem because everything that we do online is mediated. It all goes through third parties. It goes through our ISPs, our telcos, our mail service providers, and so on. And so if one of those links is encrypted, but you want the person at the other end to be able to read and process the data, then again, the technical protection has come off it. So I hear what Anne says about end-to-end encryption, but ultimately that solves the problem of intermediaries being able to read things, but it doesn't solve the problem of what Olivier can do with the data in Clear once he's received it. And that's a problem that I call privacy beyond first disclosure. So the idea that having disclosed something to someone intentionally, it's very difficult technically to find ways of preserving the confidentiality of that information once the intended recipient has read it. So that's the tip of the iceberg in terms of the technical issues. It's one example. If I look at this from the policy perspective, as I say, it's not a zero-sum game. And the reductio ad absurdum of that is, if it were, then sacrificing 100% of your privacy would guarantee you 100% security, and that's clearly not the case. Nor would I want to live somewhere where that was the approach. So how do we actually fix this? I think part of it is, and this is kind of necessary but not sufficient, people have to be aware that there's a problem. They have to be motivated to do something about it. And they have to be equipped to do something about it. And I slightly qualify that last one. But people at least need to be motivated and aware. Or, if they're not equipped to do something about their own privacy, they have to have the option of delegating to a trusted third party to do something about their privacy for them. Now this is important because it seems that the main reason why we don't do anything about privacy is we can't be asked, to be frank. So there's a very low sort of convenience threshold, isn't there? You know, if maintaining my privacy means I can't play Pokemon Go, then I'll play Pokemon Go, or sign up to Facebook, or use Twitter, or so on. So the kind of inconvenience threshold we're prepared to step over is extremely low. And so under those circumstances, there are a couple of approaches. One is, as I say, that you make it possible for users to delegate that effort to something or someone else. So a trusted third party, a proxy, a device that on your behalf, for example, to tweak your privacy settings when you sign up with a new social network. And there's quite an interesting thing that Carnegie Mellon have just launched, I think, which offers to look at the apps you've got on your mobile device and come back to you with a kind of, A, are you sure you want this one? And B, if you do want it, I can turn these off for you if you want. Okay, so that's the user delegating to, in this case, a technical proxy. But obviously you could delegate to a service provider if you trusted them to act in your interest and say to your service provider, please will you manage my, I'll give you an indication of my privacy preferences, please will you take it from there. And then just as a last one, I think it's really important to be aware of the economics of online behavior. So many of the things we do online are monetized by third parties whom we probably never interact with. So in interacting with a social network, it's not clear who the consumers are to whom that social network is selling the data about you, and you probably never interact with them. So that's the economic flywheel that powers a lot of what we do online. And we as the consumer, we as the individual, have very little influence on that flywheel. What does have an influence on it is the economics of how data is monetized and how that ecosystem works and what the food chain is. So that seems to me to be an area where consumer behavior can get very little change, but regulation and policy making traditionally have had more powerful levers in that area. That's probably about enough from me, I think.
Can I just ask one question, yeah. Robin, so just so that we're all on the same page? When you talked about the issue of the recipient of the data, that really you can't trust that they will not also disclose it, what does that add to the equation then that we're discussing? I mean, why is that important? I mean, presumably in a human situation where we're not talking about M2M, but you have to trust that other person or else you wouldn't send the information in the first place. But I was wondering I didn't hear what the implications of that were, and I thought it might be interesting for the further discussion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a good point. And this is something that we learn, this isn't something we learn about from online interaction. This is something we learn in the playground, isn't it? that you told your best friend your biggest secret, and the next thing you know, 3 other people are pointing and laughing. And you think, well, wait a minute, how did they find out? Oh, my best friend told them. And all of a sudden, your trust estimation of your best friend suddenly undergoes a radical change. So yes, you're right. I mean, if I'm sending someone something which I wish them to receive in confidence, I trust them, but what do I trust them for? And so this notion of trust tends to be bandied about in a very generic, vague way. I might trust Olivier to know what to do with the information that I'm giving him in the same way that I trust my doctor to know how to diagnose my ailment. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I trust him not to do something else with it as well. Okay, so I think we often need to unpack the idea of what we mean by trust. So for instance, I remember in the e-commerce days, everyone was saying that banks were going to become either certificate authorities for public key infrastructure or identity providers, or both. And the banks were saying, well, why would that be us? And the pundits would say, well, because you're trusted. People trust you. And I think, well, yeah, I do trust my bank, but I trust them to do very specific things. I trust them to maintain my current balance with integrity and to provide me an audit trail of the transactions that they apply to it. It doesn't mean I trust them to maintain my car, for example, or bring up my children. So I think often that notion of trust needs to be teased apart into what are we trusting someone to do.
We're already up and running on the debate. Go ahead.
May I just make a little point on this one? I think this is a particular case concerning personal data, which you are mentioning, but which has a much broader implication. This is the recognition of the ownership of data. Who is the owner of data? And one friend passing data to another one doesn't recognize the ownership, is infringing the ownership. So what matters is to define properly the different roles regarding data. Who is the owner? Who is the user? The user is probably someone doing analytics on the data. And who is the beneficiary? The beneficiary can be yet another person who benefits from the analytics and gets a pre-digested result. An easy case is when you go and see your general practitioner with medical data from you. You are the source of the data, but you are not the owner. The data has been acquired, is analyzed, and then mediated back to you, and you are the beneficiary of the data. And this is beyond the simple question of personal data. This is the question of data and who owns data, who does the magic of creating huge advertisement revenues from data they don't own, but you give them for free. Are we stupid? Maybe we are. And this is a zero-cost input economy where the magic is on the other side of the equation. You have revenues. So this is an interesting case. It's a particular case of the data economy. It's a very interesting one, but it's a particular one.
Brenda, why don't you now continue with
So
can I just do a quick check? An aside, how many other lawyers are there in the room? Any of you done conveyancing law, that sort of thing? Okay, we might come back to that later.
We would know that.
Okay, so on the topic of ownership, we might have a further discussion if it fits in.
This is a good introduction for what I wanted to say, in fact. My main point coming here was an observation that cyber security is in the hands of IT specialists, technicians, the cyber security people, the mysterious guys doing manipulations, doing friendly hacking at night, and spending nights on the computers while you sleep, and protecting your networks on your behalf sometimes, whereas your privacy is in the friendly hands of the lawyers, which are represented here, and the lawyers act in court. They act when a privacy breach has been demonstrated, and maybe after that you can be compensated. The idea of cybersecurity is to do preventive actions to prevent breaches to happen. You can't prevent it 100%, but you can reduce the risk. the privacy protection usually is not so technical, but legal. And there is a discrepancy between the two. So my point would be, why wouldn't we act more technically on privacy protection and more legally on cyber security? So another issue, digging a little bit more into the practice of privacy protection and how is privacy handled in IT systems. Very often people consider it's all about personal data protection. Personal data protection and anonymization of such data. Examples are not a proof, but counter examples are a proof. I'd like to ask you a little quiz. Do you know a cyclist who likes ice creams and who likes crimson coaches advertising for the NHS? And he's been on the front page quite recently, and you know him. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
I think. Sorry, no. I put this in because I'm not going to embarrass myself.
When you mentioned cyclists and ice cream, I thought of Boris Johnson. But
Yes. Yes. So I mean, we have no personal data about him. This is just a description of his activities, and I can tell you another story about the owners of public information. Public information in the embodiment of car plates. So a car with a plate 2B and another car usually parked next to this one with not 2B. It's very humoristic in a way. But this is a good way to define two people, and you find them very quickly if you can use a search engine. You find their names, you find their date of birth, you find their address, and you have not used any personal data along this path. So this is a good proof that personal data protection and anonymization is just, I shouldn't say it, but it could be looked at like a farce, because it doesn't protect anything at all. Especially when my bank calls me and asks me for a secret code, which is my date of birth. I'm surprised, really. Anyway, personal data protection not being enough, activity protection is interesting, is quite important to do. And you do that in practice. When you leave your home for a long time, you usually can organize for lights to be put on and off automatically and things like that. In the Internet of Things, you could do many more things to emulate activity, to create decoys, to create a stealth mode whereby the threat, the adversary, the burglar, the murderer can be relying on uncertain information, whereas before the information could have been certain. Because in your airspace, in your radio space, you can buy for £10 at Sainsbury's at least 2 products which give me a good way to know when somebody is ringing at your door or when somebody is changing the color of the lights of your LCD lights in your home. So I know that you are there, that someone is there. And the joke could be someone is ringing at your door and in fact is ringing at me. So I know that with radio it's always easy. And if radio is unencrypted, of course, this is a weakness. And we in standards, we have to react. We have to create security, built-in security, and the possibility for people to protect themselves against intrusions into their lives. So I think it's broadening a little bit from the online security to the security in the digital domain and in the physical domain, in the cyber physical domain. So this is really full of question marks, and full of opportunities for solution suppliers like yourself. I'm done with that.
Okay.
Talal, go ahead, take over from there.
Okay, so hi everybody, my name is Talal Rajab, I'm the Head of Cyber and National Security at TechUK. I'm obviously not Charlotte Holloway, who was originally advertised on your agenda. So I just quickly put together some thoughts in the last hour and a half when I got told I'd be stepping up to the panel. And sort of the main issue, the main sort of theme that I like to put out there is that we constantly debate and talk about privacy and security, and those two words are constantly intertwined. But having looked at national security legislation and stuff like the Investigatory Powers Bill and current RIPA, that's the current legislation sort of in play at the moment, I don't really tend to see it as a battle or a balancing act between privacy and security. It's more a balancing act between one type of security or protection of your personal data, security of your data that you put online, and then another type of security, which is the security that sort of national security issues. So it's balancing one type of security with another type of security. Can we have our personal data online secure and protected from malicious actors, bad states, whilst also ensuring that the security services are able to do their jobs effectively and make use of new technologies. So for my sins for the past year and a half, I've been looking and watching the Investigatory Powers Bill go through Parliament and doing a number of consultation responses on behalf of the TechUK members on RIPA. And one thing we sort of want to keep stressing and emphasising is that companies do take the protection of their customers' data extremely seriously. And it's now come to the point where you, as a company, you gain a competitive advantage over your rivals if you're able to keep your customers' data secure, not only from sort of criminals, but also from the accidental things that those customers do themselves. A lot of the time, cyber attacks on malicious actors gaining access in. It's your users not adequately protecting themselves or not having correct password protections and so forth. Now, we did say initially that we weren't going to talk about Brexit, but most of what I prepared was actually about Brexit. So yeah, do excuse me, I'm sort of going to go through it on that front. A lot of stuff is unclear at the moment regarding Brexit. I guess one thing we can say with reasonable confidence is that any country that wishes to share data with the EU sort of needs to or handle EU citizens' data. That country will be assessed in terms of the adequate level of protection and security that they give to citizens. So that therefore is going to play a major consideration in our negotiations with our EU partners as we negotiate our withdrawal. So the legal basis for a free flow of data, not only going out of the UK, but also EU citizens' data coming in the UK, is going to play a major part of the negotiation process, we feel, from TechUK's perspective. And that therefore means we need to learn the lessons of Safe Harbour and Privacy Shield. You know, I see a lot of people sort of raising their eyebrows. I know it was quite a long negotiation process, and a lot of lessons need to be learned. But the future transatlantic data flows were at real risk at one point due to the collapse of Safe Harbour. And if we want to continue our access into the single market, we need to ensure that we don't go through, as the UK, a similar process to what the US had to go through. And then therefore the big elephant in the room within all this is the Investigatory Powers Bill. There are a number of avowed powers within that bill that if you think, I mean, if the EU sort of thinks that the US's national surveillance legislation was relatively opaque and so forth, they haven't seen anything yet when it comes to the Investigatory Powers Bill. And there are a number of, I've sort of identified 7 key areas within the IP bill that if you're looking at an adequacy agreement, these 7 capabilities or provisions within the bill are going to require careful consideration. Now, I don't have the answers to that. That's probably something for David Davis to look into, and he's a real expert when it comes to the bill. But I've sort of mapped out a grid which I'm more than happy to send around to people after this discussion on some of the key areas. So one part of the bill is a mandatory 12 months data retention for companies, so requires communication service providers, and we can get into a bit of a discussion what a communication service provider is. later on, but they're going to be required if they're giving a retention notice to hold their customers' data for a period of 12 months. Within that, and within the definition of data, we've got the great new term internet connection records, and if many of you were familiar with the previous Snoopers Charter and the issue of weblogs, and that's sort of broadly defined, but data which will look at what a citizen has accessed in terms of web pages, in terms of social media apps, that will also fall under the requirement of data that will need to be retained by companies for a period of 12 months. We've then got the issue of bulk collection and bulk interception of communications data. And our EU privacy laws require data collection to be legitimately targeted rather than collected in bulk. But the IP bill makes explicit for the first time that the security services have the capability to intercept and collect data in bulk. And then when you look at the bulk powers allowed within the bill, you've also got bulk equipment interference, which is another fabulous term within the bill, which is essentially state-sponsored hacking of devices and services. Now again, how will that comply with any adequacy agreement that we try to negotiate with the EU? And that allows the security services to intercept or sort of interfere, with networks and services in bulk en masse. But once they put a warrant out there. Then again, with bulk powers, you've got the issue of bulk personal data sets. So these are data sets held by both public and private organizations in bulk, and the security services will be able to get access to these again with a legal warrant. So the examples that are given in evidence during the committee stages where the electoral roll, the telephone directory, and then the contents that could also contain medical records and other types of data. You've then got the issue of thematic warrants, where a particular individual doesn't have to be identified within a warrant, so it's not targeted. And it can apply to a whole organisation. Again, how will that comply with EU regulation? And then we've got the issue of self-authorised access for communications data. So public authorities are able to self-authorise their own access to particular communications data or communications records. Now, those are just 7 aspects of the bill. There are a number of other issues within the bill that require further scrutiny. But then if we're looking at how we sort of deal with our European partners going forward, if we wanted to create our own version of Privacy Shield with the EU, this bill is going to come sort of within focus, and it's going to be a major issue. It may help or hinder the process, the fact that we've got Theresa May as Prime Minister and David Davis dealing with our Brexit negotiations. It remains to be seen. But this is something that isn't going to go away. I initially thought that once the bill went through Parliament at the end of the year, I would have to stop working on it, but it seems like my work will probably be carrying on for a number of years going forward.
Thanks, Talal, and I think it's also premature to be talking about the negotiations over Privacy Shield in the past tense, because Mr. Schrems will be filing a challenge very soon, and I think the issues that Snowden raised, which are the ones that had caused all of the problems, other things had been raised but were resolvable, will clearly have to be addressed here, and I don't think we've heard the end of it vis-a-vis the United States either. So that's a very tough issue. I know that we had one intervention that was requested, so I'm going to hand the floor over to Philip for a minute or two to make it his point before we turn it over to the audience. Philip, a few minutes, okay?
Hi. Hopefully you've all got a 2-side crib sheet of the main recommendations from the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee on cybersecurity. And I'm not going to go through them, I'm just going to give the really critical thing, because it raises the convergence between all these wonderful views of cybersecurity good practice and the real world. Usually a Select Committee advisor, which I was, comes in at the start of an inquiry and helps it roll forward. I was brought in more or less at the tail end, and the key thing to remind you is the story of the Emperor's new clothes. My role was really, as I scanned the evidence and the draft report, was to give them the confidence that they were not being stupid when they not only queried the luminescence of wonderful cybersecurity practice, but also had grave doubts about the integrity of the emperor's underwear. And the core thing in this is, the inquiry was triggered by TalkTalk incident, revealed the tip of an enormous great iceberg, and a whole raft of law based around data protection and breach notification, which does absolutely nothing to protect anyone from the real world threats. Data breach notification merely tells the sharks, here is a wounded animal, come and feed with your fishing. So the core thing in there is that none of those recommendations require any change in law. They are all fully compatible with the new GDPR. They are all about how the law is implemented. And in particular, the size of the fine, what determines whether it's nominal or whether it's massive, and things like, have you actually made it possible, let alone easy, for your customers to identify a communication really is from you? If you haven't, and the odds are that your website is in breach of the e-commerce directive because there's no ability to do physical contact, you've got no routines that you're publicizing, then the fine in the event of a breach is much, much bigger. Because one of the issues is what's the breach you notify, because most breaches, it's 100 and odd days between the breach occurring and you discovering it. So therefore it's all about what's out in the wild. The other thing there is about how you report things, what you report, to whom. And the other relevant thing is that this note was for an audience called SASIG, Security Awareness Special Interest Group. 2,500 people responsible for security awareness in medium to large organizations, banks, telcos, the rest of it. No suppliers allowed. Now, 2 workshops I presented this to. One was joint with the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development, because it's all about people processes and technology in support of people. The other for the Chartered Institute of Purchasing and Supply, because it's all about security along supply chains, because all the big breaches don't occur in the organization that nominally has the breach. They appear somewhere along the supply chain. So I do recommend reading the recommendations. I recommend reading the main report. I emphasize specialist advisors are not allowed to speak for the Select Committee. The Select Committee speaks for itself, but I've got full clearance from the chairman to wind industry audiences up, to read the report, think about the implications, and also think about how they're going to work together to address the implications. That was it.
Thank you, Philip. I mean, I just on a personal note, a personal note. Yeah, I'm doing good. Sorry, doing a little dance there. Be careful though if anybody else is using that step. It's not stable. You know, before the GDPR came into effect, I've been advising under the European Data Protection Directive and the national implementations of it for many years. And basically, when clients try to sort out what they need to do, and they realize that it's going to be rather expensive and require process change and all of the rest, they walk off and say, oh, well, we'll come back to it later. We'll call you later. And now with the GDPR having the 4% global turnover or 20 million euro, whatever's higher penalty, which was, widely debated and was higher at one point, actually. People are starting to pay attention, and I think this issue of, and it goes back to sort of what you were saying, Renaud, as well, the lawyers do play a role here. It is not only in court that the lawyers play a role. The lawyers also try to do a translation of what is the commission / member states, DPAs, etc. What is it that what is it that the law says, and how can that be interpreted? I mean, we're going through this right now on the GDPR. There are some aspects of it that, you know, as well-intentioned as you might be, as well-educated as you might be, it is super difficult to figure out how to advise clients how this should be interpreted. And it doesn't mean, though, I really do not believe that we should just all throw up our hands and say, ah, privacy is dead, who cares? Because really, it isn't, to me. I mean, it is a cultural thing. Some countries, it really doesn't matter. I was reading transcripts of the Senate committee's deliberations over whether the U.S. Federal Communications Commission is overdoing it by, you know, requiring telecoms operators, now regulated as, you know, regular telecoms operators, even though, you know, the broadband issue was a huge one in the United States about whether it should be subject to regulation. And saying, you know, look, at the U.S. has been different. We shouldn't, you know, diverge from our sort of non-regulatory, our, you know, non-interventionist approach. It's great, but I mean, that is going to create big problems for transatlantic trade. It will, because of the cultural differences between what we're doing here and what we're doing there. And so I'll mention one other thing, which is the e-privacy directive, which is now undergoing review by the European Commission. And one of the things that's being considered there, and it's also a feature now of the GDPR and also the Digital Sales Directive, and it goes back to a point that I think you might have made, Renaud, which is that there is a suggestion that any data that is not required to actually perform the transaction cannot be mandated. So the way in the GDPR it's phrased is that utmost consideration will be given to the fact that the data was not necessary when determining whether or not consent was voluntary in the first place. The digital sales contract basically says, at least one of its iterations, that, you know, you may not mandate that personal data be given unless it's necessary to perform the transaction. So if you've got to, you know, finance this particular service, you might have to have a subscription model. Might be the only option. And with respect to the privacy directive, there's a, you know, similar line of inquiry. So, and the one last issue I would raise is that there is an industry paper saying that the privacy directive should be scrapped, which may make sense in light of the GDPR, except for one provision, which is content. Under the e-privacy directive and all the national implementations of it, electronic communications provider, as defined by that law, they are not allowed to access content unless it's subject to a lawful access request by law enforcement. So, okay, Google and others get to use algorithms to review the content of emails and so forth, and the telcos want to be there as well. I mean, do you really feel that it's appropriate, do we all feel as a culture, that there's a slight difference between BT listening to my phone call and Google Analytics looking at my email? I don't know. I'm not answering the question. I just do think it's a very important question. So with all of those discombobulated thoughts having fallen off the step there, let me ask the audience if you have any questions or comments that you want to raise, and if not, we'll carry on. Robin, do you want to have the last word, because we have a time problem? Yeah, maybe you'd like to wrap up, give your final thoughts, solve all of the problems of the evening in 5 minutes.
We've seen a lot of problems being raised, but no answers. So now you've got 5 minutes for the answers. Fix it.
There is one. Take it off the net.
Yeah, take it off the net. Yeah. Well, I think that's an interesting line of thought to pursue, actually, as David says. You know, to what extent can you remain connected and remain secure? And Brian, you brought this up as well. I think the impact that we can see coming down the road of connected things removes so much user agency. Sorry, I didn't talk about user agency before. This idea of user agency, what is it in the system that gives effect to the user's intentions and preferences? Okay, and to my mind, the advent of IoT erodes user agency like nothing else. Because all of a sudden, you're, anyone who used to like, did you like the Peanuts cartoons, the Snoopy things? Do you remember the little kid called Pigpen, who was always grubby? And he walked around in this little cloud of crud. Well, that's our devices. We're all Pigpen. We're all surrounded by this cloud of digital crud. which reveal stuff about us. Now, in that sense, okay, I've got a smartphone in my bag, but it's off. I've got an iPad in there, but it's off. And when I turn them on, they'll come up in airplane mode. That's my choice. But when I walk out of here, the City of London's got all sorts of wonderful things around the place that will track me from here to Paddington or Waterloo or wherever I might or might not be going, over which I can exercise no choice or no consent and no control. And the more of those devices there are out there that are connected, the more you are enmeshed in this web, from which essentially the escape velocity is infinite. So that worries me going forward.
There's someone who works for the Internet Society promoting the Internet.
I love the internet. It's a question of what people plug into it. So in the interest of time, I'm going to point out two things about that, and then I'll stop. The first one is, as machine learning improves, I want that artificial intelligence to be put at my disposal. I want my smartphone to be able to take my initial statement of preferences and run with it and enforce it. Okay, so I think there's scope for much more to be done with AI on our behalf. The second thing is that it raises a whole load of ethical issues about who bears the responsibility when an algorithm does something. And to what extent can machines now learn behavior that was not part of their input parameters, essentially. So AI researchers are already observing that they'll set a thing running in the evening, come back in the next morning, and it's exhibiting behavior that they had not predicted. Well, to what extent are they responsible for the things that it does after that? And I think there's a real ethical strand to be teased out there. But perhaps for another meeting.
I know. And do you want to have a last minute?
I guess, yeah, I don't want to stop people from getting towards their wine level, so I'll just make one last statement. GCHQ are now starting to become a lot more public-facing, doing a lot more public interviews, and they did a fabulous piece in the Times towards the end of last year, where they spoke about changing the culture of the organisation to mimic and ape the Silicon Valley companies. So that's the way they're looking at how their future. Well, that's sort of the culture of Silicon Valley. That's what they're looking to do. They're looking towards the private sector and seeing some of the technologies and the practices that are spawning new technologies.
What will be the impact on innovations?
Yeah, sort of time where they can go off and sleep and come up with new ideas. But that's the future of the way we're going to be going forward. And what we need to make sure is that doesn't impact citizens and consumers' use of digital devices. We talk about IoT. We don't want to prevent the use of this technology because it's going to have a lot of benefits going forward. So these are issues that are just going to continue going forward for quite a while.
I would just like to add a little bit to the surface of attack exposed to hackers and cybersecurity threats. We have spoken mostly of communications records. That's the classical internet. With the Internet of Things, we have the sensors, and your phone has probably over 10 sensors, position, motion, speed, etc., and the cameras. And all this is additional information which is much more, much deeper, in fact, than the communication. And it gives you the position, it puts you in physical danger, potentially. So it's much more immediate than just your political opinion, which might change, by the way.
Well, I think we've come to the end of what I wish could be another couple of hours of discussion. This has been really terrific. My own personal view is that human beings do have a right and the responsibility and the way forward, and that we need to exercise this. It's a matter of groupthink. It takes really courageous people to say, yes, even though we can do this, we should not do this. And frankly, when you've got a lot of competitors who are doing something different, it's very, very hard, to have an ethical view. So I do think law is necessary. I do think enforcement is necessary, and the lawyers really do have to understand the technology, or it's all useless. And the technology folks are going to have to understand the law, because otherwise they won't know how to implement it. Yeah. So in any event, that doesn't really give anybody a solution, but I do think it means that there's going to be a lot of work for most people in this room, and a lot of worry and concern as well. And we'll see if everybody ends up having an off-grid room in their safe, like a new safe house concept, you know, emulating Singapore, the trendsetters. Great, thank you so much. Let's give a round of applause to our speakers and to yourself.
Thank you very much. Great.